The Employment Roundtable podcast is produced by the GableGotwals law firm. The Employment Roundtable is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not contain legal advice or create an attorney-client relationship. The information provided should not be taken as an indication of future legal results. Any information provided should not be acted upon without consulting legal counsel. Welcome to the Employment Roundtable, where we provide you with the perspectives and information you need to make wise employment decisions for your employees and your organizations. I'm your host, Talitha Ebrite, and today we're talking with Holly Cole, Director of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission of Oklahoma, and my GableGotwals partners, Ellen Adams and Paula Williams, about the first of our three-part series relating to the intersection between employment and health. This episode is focused on employers' obligations relating to employees' caregiving responsibilities. So, Holly, as I understand it, during the pandemic, the EEOC issued some new guidance regarding caregiving. Will you please just summarize that guidance for us?
Sure, and thanks, Talitha. And what I'm about to talk about can be found on EEOC.gov, and it is a separate guidance dealing specifically with people who are caregivers, and it relates to all of the statutes, all 5 of the laws that we enforce. And it was this one came out in March of 2022 because it has a focus on caregiving responsibilities related to COVID-19 issues. So and if you look at that guidance, another thing you're going to see are employer best practices that people can do when they're dealing with their employees or even with applicants who may have caregiving responsibilities specifically related to the pandemic. So I think I want to go into that a little bit further, but I'd like to kind of hear, I think, what Paula and Ellen, their take on it is from that employer perspective.
Absolutely. Sounds great. So let's get into that then, Paula. So in your view, how does the EEOC's guidance, which you've reviewed, relate to assumptions that have traditionally been made regarding gender and caregiving?
Sure. So I think typically most people think of women as caregivers, and that stereotype about caregiving responsibilities and who bears them in a household can create an opportunity for discrimination. If, say, an employer is hesitant or refuses to hire a woman or promote a woman to greater responsibility out of concern that she may need time off to care for young children or care for adult relatives and the like. So an employer shouldn't make an assumption about an employee, especially a woman, about her caregiving role and whether she can handle additional responsibility. It's that employee who should get to decide, can I handle more responsibility? Do I want to seek a promotion? Do I want to seek this job opportunity? On the opposite side of that coin, employers can treat men differently too. So we know that stereotype is often false and that many men step in to provide as caregivers. Employers can't treat a male differently based on an assumption that he's the breadwinner and shouldn't need time off. And they should consider time off requests just like they would a female caregiver. And Talitha, if I could mention just one more protected class here, or one more category, we see this in LGBTQ, which the EEOC highlights in this as well, and I think is particularly insightful for caregivers. So often, LGBTQ employees have often encountered additional burdens and hurdles, additional procedures to try to take time off for caregiving. So if an employer is going to request things like proof of a relationship before taking time off to provide caregiving, they need to be sure that they're also imposing those same burdens or procedures on non-LGBTQ employees, because otherwise it's potential discrimination. And so the EEOC provides this great guidance for us to remind us that those stereotypes are often not true and can create the opportunity for discrimination in the workplace.
That's great. Thank you so much, Paula. So now, Holly, are the legal protections for caregiving obligations under the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act, do they apply in every employer-employee scenario?
Well, they would. They would. I mean, the ADA is going to be applicable to every phase of employment, whether it be advertising, hiring, termination, everything in between. So it is going to apply in those situations. But not when we're talking about maybe COVID or pandemic related issues, that's not necessarily going to invoke the ADA. But there could be situations where someone has, since we're talking about caregiving, someone is a caregiver for someone who has experienced, they have COVID and they're experiencing maybe some disability related issues because of that, or they're continuing to have the lingering effects of COVID and they still need a caretaker. So in that situation, the ADA says if you have an association with someone with a disability who needs you to care for them, then you're protected from discrimination. On the other hand, what is not relevant about the ADA is regarding caregiving is the need for a reasonable accommodation. So the caregiver is not likely to be that person, with a disability. They're just caring for someone. So it wouldn't be appropriate for the employer to have to grant them a reasonable accommodation, for instance, leave, so that they can stay home and care for someone.
Okay. And so now what about like under the Family Medical Leave Act, Ellen, for example, what triggers an employee's protections for caregiving obligations under that act?
Sure. Thanks, Talitha. So, as distinguished from the ADA, where an employer does not have to accommodate an employee who's caring for someone with a disability, under the FMLA, an employer has to grant leave if someone has a need to care for an immediate family member with a serious health condition. So there's leave protections under the Family Medical Leave Act that are different from what would be required under the ADA. And under the Family Medical Leave Act, that leave, if it's medically necessary, can be intermittent leave as well. When we talk about a serious health condition, we're talking about when someone is not able to perform essential job duties. Obviously, when we're talking about it in the context of caregiving, that's an individual who can't engage in their normal life activities. So it's a child who's unable to attend school, by way of example. And that would generally constitute a serious health condition if there's a medical issue that's preventing that child from being able to attend that could trigger those FMLA obligations for an employer.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. Now, Paula, we know, all of us know, I think, that the labor market has been really tough pretty much since the beginning of the pandemic. What suggestions do you have for employers who are trying to run competitive businesses with limited labor force while still supporting their employees in their caregiving roles?
Yeah, that's a tough question, Talitha, because it's really going to be different based on the employer, how big of an operation they're running, what industry they're in, what kind of regulations apply, who their clients are, even if the job involves manual labor or if they're mostly desk jobs. And so what the nature of the employer's business is going to really play into what I'm going to say next. But the two most common ways we see are flex work and telework or remote work. And so I want to just talk briefly about those two. With flex work, the employee is working typically a different time frame of hours, or maybe a different set schedule. Maybe they're doing an increased hours over a 2-week period to take every other Friday off. Maybe they're shifting to work 10-hour days Monday through Thursday. Maybe they're starting their workday earlier than the standard schedule to finish earlier. Some employees just need predictable schedules. Flex work can help provide that. Some employees need more flexibility in their schedule when they're caregiving to deal with more emergencies. Some project-based employees can be very flexible in the workplace. So if an employee largely works independently at a desk, an employer may have a greater ability to say, I have a deadline. I don't care if you start at 7:30 or work until 11 at night. I don't need you regularly in meetings. I just need you to get the work done. that gives a caregiving employee a lot of flexibility on when they go to doctor's appointments and when they're working from home. And well, I guess that brings in the remote work, which I'll touch on, but flexible hours can be really beneficial to an employee with caregiving responsibilities. If the employee is really integral on a team project, though, with team meetings and team correspondence, that lends itself more to regular business hours and maybe even in-office meetings. I know we all love our Zoom meetings, but some employers ask that those employees be on site for meetings, and that's fair too. So based on the nature of the position, flex work may not be a great fit, but the employer is going to need to evaluate that not just per employee, but also per job. So even within one job that maybe fits the metrics of what I just said may lend itself to flex work. If the employee is brand new, there may be other reasons that the employer wants them on site at regular times with regular hours that match their team, just to integrate the employee, for example. So whatever the employer's decision on flex work, they're going to want to document it well so that they remember why they allowed flex work if they did, and why they may not want to allow it in another instance. The second example that I would give employers is remote work. So remote work, again, got very popular in the last 3 years. I can't imagine why. I like to take advantage of remote work from time to time. But remote work is its own animal for employers. And it's not as easy as, can I work from home occasionally? Sure. Employers need to think of a lot of things like, what equipment is the employee working on? Do they have a sustainable internet connection? Are we requiring them to have a reliable internet connection? If they're not on our company computers, what is the security offsite? Is our information secure? What are their hours when they're working remotely? And how do we know if they're keeping them? Are they expected to take a lunch break if they're hourly? So we have some pretty comprehensive policies for employers to consider if they're going to allow remote work. A lot of times remote work is appropriate on a more limited and temporary basis as an accommodation, perhaps. And you always want to be very specific about what the arrangement is, what the expectations are, and when and how you and the employer are going to follow up to make sure that those expectations are being met. That way, we're not setting anything in stone, but we have these tools we can utilize as long as they're still working for the employer and the job's getting done.
Definitely. Really great suggestions. Thanks, Paula. Now, so Ellen, I think that the pandemic has shown all of us that these types of arrangements aren't the productivity killers that a lot of employers feared that they could be, So even with that sort of new understanding that we all have, what recommendations can you offer for managing performance and morale for caregiving employees who are on, flexible or remote working arrangements?
Sure. The flexible working arrangements, I think, as Paula indicated, the difference are a little bit easier from a management standpoint, as long as those core business hours are avoided with the flex work arrangement that's in place. The remote work presents a little bit more of a challenge, but not one that I think is insurmountable, depending again on the employer and the nature of the business. Obviously, if you've got someone who you have hired to be your receptionist and you have a high traffic office, it does not make sense for that person to perform that job from home. Similarly, if you have someone on a line where you've got things that have to be made and put together and you need hands there at machinery to do it, it's not a job that's ever going to work remotely. So we're talking about a discrete set of employees where the job duties can actually be performed remotely first. Second, it's how do you manage employees who are capable of performing their job in a remote setting? And it's a balance between setting some objective benchmarks and allowing room for some subjectivity without creating environments where you could expose yourself to discriminatory or unfairness allegations, which are morale busters and potentially legal compliance issues. So the best way to do that, and Paula touched on this, is be clear about your expectations. So let them know what you expect of them. And then make sure that your managers and supervisors are using best practices in managing employees. What that means is we do set forth clear expectations, and then when issues arise, we address them. And we address them promptly and with documentation. And that becomes even more critical when you're dealing with someone in a remote environment where you don't necessarily have the frequency of interactions and you don't have the visual layer of supervision that you might otherwise have. And then, as Paula mentioned, scheduling touch points. Some employees are well suited for remote work because they're self-motivated and don't get distracted easily by other things that can happen in a remote environment. And it's more difficult for other employees. So setting up a trial basis to see if something is going to work, I think, is fair game. If there become performance issues, you can address those, but make sure that you're documenting them and addressing them consistently across your employees who are working in that job. And that's the best way to both keep employee morale up, make sure that the job is getting done effectively, and also to avoid claims that people are being treated differently.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen. And did you have something to add, Holly?
I did. Two things. One that Paula touched on, and I think it's so important, is doing that individualized look at the nature of the work and the people performing that work. I don't know that we've lived in a cookie cutter employment situation in decades. So the nature of the workforce is so different now than it was even 5 years ago. So being flexible when you're applying your policies and when you're looking at accommodation issues is just so key. And it just makes good business sense. And then the thing that stood out to me that Ellen mentioned is performance. I remember the day when there were federal agencies who did not want to have a telework program because they were convinced it wasn't going to work. Everybody was going to go to the house and sit on the couch and not do anything. Of course, we know the data does not support that.
Right.
The data supports that the nature of most jobs can be performed offsite. And to Ellen's point, if you have someone who's self-directed and who can manage their workload, then it works perfectly, and it is something that's very attractive that employers can offer. It's that we're a best place to work because this is a flexibility that we offer for people. So to her point, I think you deal with performance as a performance problem. You don't say we're going to get rid of our telework program because this one or two employees, it's not working for them. You address it as it comes up, and make whatever tweaks that you need to make to your policy, but don't just scrap the program. So
I think that's right, and I found those same sort of practical suggestions, and especially the way that both Paula and Ellen talked about the importance of communication. I myself have worked remotely for over 11 years now. And have worked from out of state. And that was the thing, even from the employee perspective, that I found to be just really the most important difference, is that you have to be so much more intentional about communicating and being direct, because you don't have the same cues that we get when we're sort of in a space with people. And so I just appreciated hearing that from all of you. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Holly and Ellen and Paula. And thank you for listening to the Employment Roundtable. Please join us next time as we dig into the second of our 3-part series, focusing on the intersection between employment and health. The Employment Roundtable podcast is produced by the GableGotwals Law Firm. The Employment Roundtable is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not contain legal advice or create an attorney-client relationship. The information provided should not be taken as an indication of future legal results. Any information provided should not be acted upon without consulting legal counsel.